a medium for art and design, as essential as traditional materials like paints or clay. For instance, painting, animation, and photography are just a small sample of once non-digital fields where many practitioners now incorporate software tools, such as Procreate or Storyboard Pro or Adobe Lightroom. And though users are now working with pixels and vectors instead of paints and clay, these software tools still capture many of the interactive advantages as when working with traditional media. So for instance, direct manipulation interfaces like Adobe Photoshop that let users draw on a digital canvas means that they can make concrete visual changes. And then it's easy to immediately reflect on these visual changes in a quick and continuous iterative loop. So this process lends itself well to exploratory workflows, where users don't often have predefined goals, but figure them out through a series of explorations and just sort of like, messing with the canvas. Computational tools bring additional benefits over purely analog forms, such as, the ability to undo actions, and also organize drawing into layers, which lets you both edit individual parts, such as how I'm going to change the text to be blue here, and also entire parts of the drawing at once, such as how I'm going to cast this whole drawing in a soft orange glow. So I would argue that these software features I just talked about are ways that users have power. And I think that generally when HCI researchers talk about the word power, they often mean it in this power to sense. Power to, which is like the ability to do something, the ability to get something done. Tools mediate our power too. For instance, Photoshop lets us undo operations. That gives us power, and we wouldn't have that if we just drew with like pen on paper. But there's another form of power that I want to draw attention to, and this is the notion of power over. The relationship between actors, right? Like parents have power over their kids when they tell them to go to bed at a certain time, but kids might have power over their parents when they refuse to eat the dinner that they make. For instance, if we consider, in this scenario, artists and users to be one group of actors, and the designers, developers, and researchers to be another group of actors here, then we can think of the power dynamics involved within the exchange of these two groups. And I would say that power dynamics, again, aren't inherently bad. For instance, tool developers create software abstractions, such as layers, that enable new forms of creative practice. But also with abstractions comes constraints. And one way that software developers constrain artists, and thus I would argue unavoidably exert power over them, is through having preset functionality, such as things found in a toolbar or in a menu. While software features are empowering, artists are limited to only the ones that the engineers of the system made visible and also available to them. We can see this trade-off of power to and power over clearly in the recent fast and popular advancements in AI and stable diffusion models and stuff. These models let anyone who can enter a prompt create an image, and it only took 20 seconds to make here, but obviously with the caveat that it takes like a ton of iteration and prompt engineering and stuff like that. So while these models, have their fair share of interface and interactivity issues, I would say that they do give power to generate a bunch of new images, especially for people who lack drawing skills. But beyond the technical limits of a tool, another form of power that the creators of these models have over artists is through non-consensual use of their artwork, originally, put online in their little portfolios, but now have been massively downloaded and scraped to use as training data as for these image models. So from huge media companies such as Getty Images to even small individual artists, right? Like people are filing lawsuits now against these companies, and I think these actors are trying to use the law to gain power back from image generation companies. And I think the law is also one very tangible way that we can see power dynamics get challenged, codified, and also enforced. So what happens if we want to break out of this like preset functionality, the things that the engineers of the system have already given us? Well, one thing that a lot of professional artists do, or at least some professional artists do, is they use programming. Programming enables new forms of power too, such as making algorithmic or interactive artwork, or extending preset functionality by creating plugins and add-ons to existing software programs. And also, as we'll soon see in this talk, the cultural dominance of programming and computer science also means that artists gain power over their communities because computer science is so respected, right? They have more perceived legitimacy and more perceived control. So this thesis investigates questions at the intersection of power and software tool artists in 3 different ways. First, what we do is we sort of try to understand the current use. We talked with 13 professional artists to understand how they currently use, don't use, or build their own software tools. And one takeaway from this was that we learned that many artists learn to program to gain various forms of power. So to support that, the second project in this thesis is basically an interactive debugging environment that helps artists better understand and debug their programs to make art. And we do this, we try to get this like empowerment thing going by developing features that align with the existing workflows of artists, such as the ability to quickly react to visual changes, which current general purpose debugging systems for software engineers lack. Like if you've ever had to use GDB in one of your CS classes, you know how horrible of a workflow that is. Lastly, this thesis contributes a critical and generative theory, which uses a lens of power to analyze software tools for artists. A lens of power can help us understand how technical decisions, such as what kind of abstractions that we should use or what kind of software representations we should choose, can result actually in unequal power dynamics. And this also guides us towards a new agenda for what we as researchers and developers of creativity support tools could possibly do to actually mitigate these power dynamics. So while all three of these projects address issues of power to, the first and the last, being more qualitative, address issues of power over. So this takes me to the thesis statement, which is that artists can gain power through software tools that allow them to retain fine-grained aesthetic control, leverage their manual drawing skills, and move between levels of abstraction. Beyond these kinds of power too, a lens of power should also consider the ways developers and researchers exert power over artists by creating normative ground. So when you read this, you're like, wow, there are a lot of words here. What do all of these words mean? Right? Like, what does it mean to be normative ground or like move between levels of abstraction? Hopefully, throughout this talk, you will now have an understanding of all these words that I will then operationalize. Okay, and also, since the title of this talk is Rethinking Power Dynamics in Software Tools for Artists, like I wanted to mention how each of these projects actually rethinks power dynamics through their research questions. So the first offers a more in-depth investigation around the tool use of professional artists. And one way it rethinks is that contrary to novice users, we find that forms of software automation intended to give power to make things easier or faster actually hinder professional artists because they have a lack of control. The second project rethinks how the debugging process can be more empowering for artists when debugging tools are designed to match and leverage their existing expertise and skills. While the third project, though domain-specific software features may be powerful, such as in the second project, the third project offers a more expansive view of power beyond the first two projects and also basically argues that this alignment with predefined goals is a way that developers actually exert power over their users, as it leaves little room for extending or appropriating the tools in weird ways. I think appropriating tools in weird ways also is a task that is very integral to artistic practices. Okay, so getting started, let's talk about why professional artists use, don't use, or build their own software tools, and also how this intersects with power. So to answer these questions, we basically conducted a thematic analysis of 13 interviews with professional artists. You can see their demographics here. These artists worked across a great diversity of mediums. This is their work, right? There's some interactive installation art, some new media art, comics, typography, oil painting, etc. And from these interviews, we distilled these 6 themes. 3 of which, the top 3, I'm going to talk about today. The first theme is that artists resist forms of software automation when it prevents aesthetic control. We found that black box software automations and abstractions intended to help artists by reducing task time instead hindered them. When parameters exposed to artists did not allow for this fine-grained aesthetic control, artists just ignored them altogether, preferring their existing manual practices. So this here is an example of a hand-drawn black letter snowflake, like it's very cool radio lead typography thing. And the artist Lynn had to say about it was, quote, "If you try to set text on a path in a circle, it looks really crappy, so I'll never do it. But in an analog format where I can cut and paste the letters or draw them to be there, it looks fine. Maybe it's because of the program that it was almost taboo for me to put type in a shape because it looked terrible in the interface," right? So in the context of power, this quote shows that the taboo, poor aesthetics of a software default actually held power over Lynn, who hesitated from even making something that looked like it, since the automation prevented the power to make something that she had the aesthetic control and liked the aesthetics of. Here's another example of resisting automations. And it's when they assume one kind of rigid input data format that artists haven't made their default artworks in, which hinders, again, like interoperability and appropriation. So in this example, this is basically a vinyl cut snowflake sculpture. You can see sort of the original design files on the top left, and then like various fabricated versions of the other photos. And Molly, the artist who made this, basically she was having issues because when she put that design in the vinyl cutter file, it wasn't interpreting her lines correctly, right? Like it was basically cutting too much. It didn't interpret the lines with some thickness. So what she did was, instead of redoing her art in a file that the vinyl cutter could like interpret, she actually wrote her own custom slicing software to then actually just cut it the way that she wanted it. Because she disliked how the default algorithm interpreted her Bezier curves, she wrote her own algorithm. So in the context of power, I would say that this example shows a clear lack of power too, right? Molly could not achieve her goals of cutting the sculpture, and she couldn't modify it to fit with her existing workflows, even though the algorithm was intended to be sort of a helpful abstraction, right? In most vinyl cutters, you just upload a file and press print, and it's great, but not when you come in cases of breakdown like this. So our second theme then is artists select software constraints when they fit with their existing workflows, and also build their own constraints when they don't. So what are some examples of artists building their own constraints? Well, here's one from the artist Fish McGill. I won't read this quote, but basically he wrote a custom processing script that fades your strokes over time, and this was in the context of his class. He saw that his students were super nervous getting started with drawing, so he was like, okay, well, if we just fade your strokes, then you don't see them in the end, and it's fine, you can draw whatever you want, right? In the context of power, Fish here gave his students the power to draw without pressure, while also exerting power over them as they were forced to use the tool that he built for class, but I would say not necessarily in like a bad or oppressive way. Here's another example of artists making their own constraints. So this is from Iran. He's also an educator and an animator, and he was noticing in his animation classes, like if you've ever worked with Adobe Premiere Pro, you know, you have to like edit the timing on the timeline and drag things very carefully. He noticed that students were doing that to the point of fatigue. So instead, he built this Loom iPad app, which you can tell there's no timeline. Like switching the frames is just moving your fingers. So it's a drawing forward process, right? Iran recognized the trade-offs here. Like if your tool has a continuous timeline rather than a frame-based one, your focus is on drawing, but instead you can't necessarily have those fine-grained adjustments that you would with different animation tools. So I think this is a trade-off in terms of the right levels of abstraction. So these examples of professional artists building their own software also fell under our last theme, which is that artists are motivated to build their own software to gain power. Sometimes this manifests as personal power, like the power to create new interactive automated artifacts, such as these interactive museum exhibits. And sometimes it's to gain technical legitimacy and also be able to influence their communities. In this framework, power over. For instance, Chris, who has made several tools, including this tool to better control NeoPixel LED lights, he said, quote, "All I can do is shape the conversation for the professional tools that get made afterwards," right? Chris here is realizing that like as a single artist, he doesn't have the engineering resources as say like a large tech company that can push out features, but he can put out tools to the world that shape the conversation and shape what is being done. Molly also pointed out the privileged role that software engineering took in the art world, saying, quote, "There's a certain part of the population that's going to think you're way cooler if you can code that thing than if you can draw it out," which is crazy. So in this section, we've seen that artists themselves can also be tool builders. They write their own software programs to design constraints and abstractions that give them the power to address their own unique needs. And also, contrary to the belief that all forms of algorithmic automations could be helpful, we learned that artists are using tools and automations made by others when they can retain fine-grained aesthetic control and have the power to appropriate them in their workflows. So I urge us to rethink the positioning of artists in our community, to realize that they can be powerful technical collaborators. Because I would argue that, like creativity support tool researchers, artists are motivated to, produce novel results and influence and have power in their communities. So to me, this qualitative research shows that, beyond initial need finding or usability methods common in human-centered design, or even beyond participatory design methods that engage artists in future decisions, artists who code can also contribute in deciding low-level engineering representations and abstractions, things that are often reserved just for, the research team or like the computer science PhDs. Okay, well, what about artists who are not yet expert programmers? How can we help every artist be empowered to understand the code they write and how the parameters they choose affect their artwork? So this was the motivation behind the second project, which is called Demystify Dynamic Brushes, where we sought to build an interactive programming environment that could better leverage the existing skills of visual artists. And more specifically, when I use the word existing skills, I mean like visual sketching, right? Sketching is very fast. It's a tightly coupled execution where you react through your hand to the pen to the page. And as such, I would argue that artists are good at visually reacting to, thinking about, and manipulating concrete media. But the process of writing code to make art is a very different process. So we can see some of the differences by analyzing the tools and interface that artists use. So let's say that the canvas for a digital artwork is basically a GUI wrapper around the artwork itself. I've been talking a lot, so here's a question for the audience. What would you say the canvas for an artwork made with code is? Was there a hand there? Yes. Exactly, the coding environment, or the IDE. So this means instead of working directly on the canvas, directly on the thing that you're drawing, right, and manipulating concrete artifacts, you are instead manipulating abstract symbols or code that represents the artwork. Instead of being able to immediately observe and reflect on how your actions result in visual changes, the process of programming and execution are separate, right? Sometimes it's unclear, like which pixel is caused by which line of code. And instead of allowing for open-ended explorations, programming is highly structured. I remember taking my first Java class, and you had to write, all these classes and stuff before you could have any hello world or any print statement. So like sometimes you have to build a lot of scaffolding before you even see anything on the canvas. And then by that point, maybe you have forgotten like what is happening or like where is anything. So I would say that if the factors afforded by GUI tools are not currently afforded by programming tools, how can we design a better canvas such that facilitates program inspection and comprehension in a way that's more empowering to artists, in a way that makes the programming workflow look more like an art workflow? So the hypothesis here was that instead of debugging by editing lines of code or slowly stepping through an execution trace, artists could be more empowered in the Power 2 sense to understand their programs if they were given an environment that, number one, leverages their immediate reactions to visual changes, and number two, leverages their existing expertise of working with concrete media as opposed to abstract symbols. And when I use the word empowered here, I mean it in the term of the sense of psychological empowerment, which was coined by Mark Zimmerman in the 1990s. And psychological empowerment comes with three things. Number one is feeling. So do we have perceived control? Do we have self-efficacy? Do I feel like I'm able to debug and make changes on my code? Number two is knowing, like do I actually have the concrete knowledge and skills, and do I understand what my action opportunities are to be able to develop and debug this code? And then the final one is doing, like can I actually take action? Can I in practice actually debug and change my code? We don't focus on the third aspect of doing because that is covered by the previous project that this work builds off of, which is dynamic brushes. So the original dynamic brushes by Jacobs et al. Is basically a tool that's split into an iPad drawing interface and a desktop programming interface. So on the desktop, you can create these programmatic brushes, and then you can draw with a stylus on an iPad. So here, the user has basically created a radial brush that mirrors their stroke 5 times in this sort of star pattern and also changes the color to be like a rainbow pattern. So what is demystified dynamic brushes? Well, basically, it extends the original dynamic brushes environment with these linked visualizations that enable artists to explore their code while drawing. For instance, these parameter values in the desktop environment, these tables of numbers, are just moved directly on the canvas and visualized. So I'll walk you through some of its features right now. The first feature is the visual inspector. So basically, it's exactly what I just said. It takes the numeric values, puts them right on the canvas, and then also draws some dots. There's also this sort of brush icon inspector that shows you various parts. So you can tell as the stroke jumps up and down, the little y-axis also jumps up and down because it represents the scale y here. This is part of our working with concrete media hypothesis. Instead of looking at symbols, why don't we look at the numbers directly on the canvas? DDB also has a direct selection feature, which basically lets artists jump to program state just by touching a pixel of the artwork, addressing the earlier issue that sometimes you don't know what line of code causes which pixel to be drawn. Also part of our concrete media hypothesis, right? We're concretely selecting from the artwork itself. And finally, DDB has this looping feature, which lets artists record and play back their past stylus inputs. So basically, if you draw something, you can just press the loop, and then you don't have to draw it anymore. The system will automatically record your stroke, while you can then go and change the program. So let's pause a little bit here to explain what's going on. So before, this little line was green, but in looping, the artists have dragged a sine wave to hue. I know it's a little small. So now, instead of having a solid teal color, the output is rainbow. And you can do this and change any sort of your program while the system loops your inputs over and over again. And again, this is part of the immediate reaction hypothesis, right? Like now we're not focusing necessarily on lines of code, but the actual visual changes that happen in your artwork. Okay, here's another quick looping example. This is a mirror brush. The left side mirrors the right side. So I've drawn something on the right side, and now what I'm going to do in real time is I'm going to change the scale Y to 0.2. It was 1. So now you can see that the left side doesn't go as deep down as the right side. Again, like visual changes. Now I'm going to change a square wave to the scale Y. So now you can see the left side jumps up and down like the form of a square wave. And then in the top left corner, you can see there's a visualization of that square wave of the current value. Okay, so in addition to all these features, we also had these numeric tables, as I mentioned, and also a stepping feature, such as common in traditional software engineering debuggers, which lets you slowly execute the function line by line. So here you can see we're just stepping through every brush parameter, and then once we finish stepping, it draws like sort of a little bit of the drawing in the lower corner. So the question was, were our features of visual inspectors, direct selection, and looping actually helpful? Was our hypothesis that leveraging artists' manual skills could empower them to better debug and comprehend programs correct? Did they actually increase the feeling and knowing aspects of psychological empowerment? To answer these questions, we basically conducted an observational study with 5 artists who had no programming experience. And we asked them to modify these 3 starter brushes on the left to these 3 target brushes on the right. And then we had some open-ended brush creation time. So it was a very observational study. And at a basic level, we saw that, yes, artists were able to understand and author their own brush programs. Specifically, we found that, 1, artists preferred to debug by using the visual inspectors and replaying and looping stylus inputs over traditional methods like stepping through an execution trace. And I think this is because it matched their existing workflows, did not require them to context switch out of drawing, by nature of these things being on the iPad instead of the computer, but also like mentally. For instance, P4 said of the numerical inspectors, quote, "This is helpful, but painful. I love it, but you have to focus, which takes you out of the drawing zone," right? They're talking about this context switch that's required. We also found qualitative evidence for greater psychological empowerment. For instance, for the feeling aspect, P2 reported a sense of perceived control and having the visual features, saying, quote, "As we created the brushes over time, I needed to know exactly what the numbers were. An hour into the session, I felt like I was translating between the world of numbers and artwork, since I could see how the correspondence was happening," right? Like that seeing helps them establish a mental connection. P3 described the visual inspectors as helping them develop skills and knowledge to comprehend how to make a spiral brush, saying, "I knew that the sawtooth wave was right, since it only went up in one direction as I drew, just like how the spiral goes in one direction, while the other generators went both up and down," right? So it was like the fact that they had these visual indicators helped them develop knowledge. Going on, they also said that about the brush indicator, "I looked at the rotation arc to see if it was full so I could make big enough changes. When it wasn't full, that's when I realized I needed to multiply it." The program itself is coded in degrees, so if you did sawtooth to rotation, it would just be between 0 and 1 degrees, so that's why you need to multiply it by 360 to get the full circle. And then they saw that because the circle was not filling up in the brush stroke indicator. So through Demystify dynamic brushes, we've demonstrated how programming environments specific to artists could look, supporting workflows that are exploratory, concrete, and manual. Because we visualized and moved program information to the canvas, to the execution rather than the programming environment, artists now have the power to engage with their code without context switching from drawing. And our direct selection and looping features gave artists the power to interact with their code from the hand rather than from symbols. So I would say that programming is a powerful tool to make art, and we wanted to make traditional software debugging workflows closer to those of manual drawing for the specific context of artists. Okay, DDB was an example where researchers hypothesized, I mean like me and the research team, hypothesized and tested what the right features, and what the right levels of abstraction for some predefined goals that we wanted to support were. I think it followed an implicit argument in a lot of CST, or creativity support tool research, which is that designing the appropriate level of abstraction for a domain-specific task or user group means that we create empowering interfaces. And I would call this method that of abstraction alignment. But in this last project, by applying a lens of power to this method, I think we can see that abstraction alignments actually aren't enough. And in fact, one way that how researchers have power over the users of their tools, despite their intentions to help. Okay, let's back up a bit first and more closely analyze the abstractions that we had in DDB. Okay, let's say we have a ladder of abstraction. The top is highest level abstraction, bottom is lowest level abstraction. And let's take, for instance, the task of changing a color of a drawn stroke, right? At a very high level abstraction, you could do something, like ChatGPT, just say make it blue, and then the program will just make it blue for you. But I would say that a high level of abstraction does not facilitate learning, right? Artists need to think through their code to make relationships between it and their artwork. So that's why in DDB, we chose a lower level of abstraction, which was visually observing numerical mappings and then actually changing the code yourself to then modify the program itself. But there might also be edge cases that require lower levels of abstraction than the one we chose. For instance, our current program works in the HSV color space, but what if artists wanted to choose colors in the RGB color space instead? Well, currently as DDB is designed, they have no way to do that, right? They would actually have to open up our source code in Swift and get it and then change everything to HSV representation. This is something that they can't currently do. And I think when artists can't access the right level of abstraction, particularly at times of breakdown or when working against black boxes, they then move horizontally to other tools in the ecosystem. We can see this with the vinyl cutter example from the first project, right? Molly could not get the vinyl cutter to interpret her Bezier curves, so she actually moved diagonally. She moved lower into a new tool to processing to then write her own custom slicer before she moved back to the vinyl cutter to then upload her newly generated toolpath here. So because of their need to appropriate or even misuse tools for their own idiosyncratic workflows, in this work, we're arguing that beyond the notion that researchers and tool developers should pre-pick a level of abstraction for artists, artists need the power to move vertically through different levels of abstraction to suit their task at hand, as well as move horizontally to interop with other tools. And I would say that this is empowerment in the technical sense, empowerment in the power to sense, right? The sense that these HCI researchers, when they wrote this design principles for a tool to support creative making, most likely meant when they said, our goal is to develop improved software and user interfaces that empower users not only to be more productive, but more innovative. But I think viewing empowerment solely through these traditional technical methods misses out on how tools can do all of these things, but still be disempowering, especially in the power over sense. So, towards a more precise understanding of how power to and power over relationships manifest in creativity support tools, I conducted interviews with 11 CST practitioners who were a mix of professional artists, tool designers, and also CST researchers, and often an overlap, right? As Sean said, I'm a CST researcher, but I am also an artist, not a professional one, though. And in contrast to the thematic analysis methods we used in the first project, here we used provisional coding. Provisional in the sense that we basically developed and iterated on a vocabulary to be able to talk about power with people, which is harder than you think. So then our goal was to build a theory of power to CSTs that could explain existing power dynamics and give predictive, critical, and generative guidance for the design of future tools. So like the first project, we also distilled 6 themes. Don't know why 6 is the magic number here. We touched on these blue ones of vertical movement and horizontal movement already. So I'm going to focus on the first 2 of what does it actually mean for artists to be empowered, and also this concept of normative ground that I will finally get to explain. And before I dive into the ways that artists felt empowered, I just want to make it clear that artists are not a monolithic group. Some of them, particularly production artists who had full-time jobs, responding to client work and stuff, felt empowered in ways that aligned with the current conversation in HCI. So for instance, P1 said the most empowering experiences were those when they didn't have to think about the tool and they could just focus entirely on the drawing. So the tool just faded in the background, which echoes ideas from ubiquitous computing and Mark Weiser. P3 said that they felt empowered by using the Liquify tool because it let them move entire parts of their drawing at once without having to manually redraw something. So like how DDB aligned with the existing skills of artists, the Liquify tool was empowering to P3 because it matched with their existing skills of judging spatial relationships while also saving them time. I would say that these examples align with what P8, who was a tool designer, said was their main goal when making tools, to, quote, remove as many obstacles as possible to enable an efficient practice. But for artists whose creative practices were not constrained by external clients, empowerment meant not making things more efficiently, but the actual reflective process of creating art, which made the invisible visible. For instance, P6 said they felt empowered when art making intentionally structured their time towards focusing on specific objects and memory, saying, quote, when I draw a picture of something, it's also time I get to spend looking at it and just thinking about all the little objects in it, just reflecting a little bit and spending time with that picture and all the memories I associate with it. I hope I'm more visible now because the lights went on. And I think this new, okay, I guess not. And this new way of seeing also extends to getting audiences to see in the way that the artist wanted to see, right? So here's an example from P4 who made a typeface by basically erasing parts of celebrities' faces in a facial recognition training set. It says Jeff Bezos if you look closely enough. And P4 said, my art directs the gaze on the powerful rather than the marginalized. It's trying to authentically capture my kind of subjectivity and worldview, right? For both P6 and P4, empowerment meant having a creative practice that not only revealed something new to themselves about how they saw the world, but also their ability to share it with others, for others who interact with the art to adopt their personal viewpoints. Artists feel empowered when they can exert power over their audiences to get them to view things in a certain way that they would not have otherwise. In fact, I would say in my personal life, like that has been the most meaningful experiences of art for me, when I look at it and then I like think something differently about the world. Okay, so if you believe in this, then what does that mean for HCI research, right? And interfaces in the first wave of HCI were often designed to make like office workers more productive at well-scoped tasks that were relatively predictable. But in contrast to creative tasks, it's kind of hard to define and predict the bounds and requirements of creative work. In fact, I would argue that some creative tasks may by their nature be defined by their misuse of tools, such as the work of P5, who was a creative coder, who said, quote, the interesting things are doing what tools are not designed for, right? Like appropriation and remixing and misuse are actually core to their process and conceptual pieces and can't necessarily be separated from the kinds of art that they make. So if creative practices are unpredictable, emergent, and messy, like, right, these are things that make creativity wonderful, but they're also really hard to computationally support. So that's why earlier I advocated for movement along the levels of abstraction, as opposed to prescribing where a user should lie, and also letting artists choose the level of abstraction that works for them as one step towards letting them appropriate and misuse tools towards their idiosyncratic workflows. So now I'm going to introduce this concept of normative ground that tries to help explain that when we do prescribe the level of abstraction of a creative practice, we can also unintentionally exert power over creative practitioners. We define a normative ground as the way a tool structures its practitioners' ideas, goals, and intentions, shaping how someone thinks, acts, and expresses themselves. So if you're thinking to yourself, oh wait, this sounds familiar, like people have already talked about this, what about like the gulf of execution and evaluation and stuff? I think the emphasis here is actually on the normative part. Right? Technology is always political and always has the values of the creators embedded in it. So when people build tools, they implicitly make a statement about what should be good, right? What is the way to empower someone. For instance, like your phone autocorrects, reinforces a belief of what good English is. And this is a way of exerting power over people by defining norms. So let's walk through some examples of our interviews to show the ways that normative ground gets enacted and how a tool's norms can actually influence practitioners' goals beyond the ways that they can fully intentionally control. One way we see how tools shape how users think is by comparing Adobe Illustrator to Adobe Photoshop. So both P1 and P3 were used to Photoshop because, you know, it's more like the workflow of drawing, but they talked really at length about learning to learn the language of Illustrator and sort of think in the program, which means thinking in terms of vectors and Boolean operations as opposed to like loose brush strokes. But once they learned things such as the Pathfinder tool, which lets you do Boolean operations on shapes and stuff, they were like, oh man, Illustrator is awesome. I can't do this artists in Photoshop. So here was a sense of having the power to do things that one program did not allow them because they then adapted their mental model to the language of Illustrator. Another part of the normative ground of a tool is its default aesthetics. So for instance, artists were considering not just the features, but also the community that surrounded it. P9 said that they had a DNA heritage around tools such as Paint Tool Sci or Clip Studio Paint, like things that were used very popular in anime drawing communities because they like to fit into that aesthetic and they like to fit into that community. They had the power to be part of a community around an aesthetic style afforded by the default brushes of these programs. On the flip side, P2 talked about their waning interest in AI art as it became more mainstream, right? They were like, oh, I'm not super interested in the aesthetic anymore because I see everyone do it. So just like how the type on a path snowflake example happened in the first project, the default aesthetics with a tool held power over the kinds of the artists and influenced the kinds of art that people wanted to make or not make with this. And again, like if you're a tool designer and you're making these tools, it's hard to predict this. Who knows if your tool is going to be super mainstream that everyone's like uninterested in using it, right? But these are things to, I think, be aware of. So also, while the ways tools establish normative ground is not entirely within a designer's control, I think one way tool designers do have control is through how people first use the tool, such as through the documentation. So processing gives many coders the power to create art. It also, I would say, constrains them to a particular kind of symbolic and abstract aesthetic because of the nature of like being a code-based program. So P5, a creative coder, lamented this uniformity, saying, quote, "The interesting stuff in art is peeling back the layers, which reveals getting to unique stylistic variations just following the docs won't. I'm always finding the tools because they try to strip all of the process away by the nature of being coding-based," right? They were working within the normative ground of processing, this coding-based sort of default aesthetic normative ground, and challenging this normative ground was actually how they defined their creative practice. Okay, so I think this is the heart of what tool designers need to contend with, sort of the paradox of empowerment here. I think the decision to make certain operations easier with the tool, the fact that the tool makes creation more accessible to people, will then set a normative default aesthetic that may actually result in uninteresting art to some practitioners. So like, how do you win in this case, right? This is a way tool designers exert power over their users, but also a chance for artists to create meaningful work by stepping out of these norms. I think solely focusing on making predefined tasks easier or more expressive doesn't provide a way for artists to challenge the normative ground of a tool, as this expressivity will still be within the tool's predefined use cases. So again, that's why we recommend tools enabling horizontal and vertical movement, as this supports artists in appropriating or extending tools for their own unique purposes, and starts to mitigate these uneven power dynamics that are created in any tool. Okay, so we talked about sort of the first part. Let's now talk about the critical part, and actually let's make sense of some past research in creativity support tools through a lens of power. For instance, there's one trend in CSTs that let users edit a representation at a higher level of abstraction. So for instance, here you're not animating every individual fish, you're drawing the motion path of all of the fishes, or in Project Blink, you edit text, you edit a video through editing the text transcript. Like again, these are very powerful features, and they make some tasks more efficient, but I would also say under a lens of power, they limit the kinds of tasks that can be accomplished, right? Since they can often computationally not support re-importing the edits done at a lower level of back to the higher level representation. For instance, with Project Blink, like if you didn't have text, but you wanted to edit the video, like there was some awkward silence or something, you would have to, go do that in Premiere or whatever. But then if you had to edit more text, you can't re-import it back to Project Blink. You're sort of stuck at this lower level. Tools that scaffold novices' abilities through applying expert computational constraints, such as helping beginners draw faces by giving them a photograph that they can trace after, or help people with 3D sculpting, or help people with photography composition. I think these are great in that they help users build up skills so they can produce higher quality artifacts. But in the context of a normative ground, we can also see that these tools sort of uphold traditional notions of what good artifacts should even look like, right? They're saying this is what is like correct, or like this is what it should look like. Even when novices become experts and no longer need these beginner tools, I think the tool's values still implicitly structure and influence their creative practices. So now that we've seen the analytical and critical applications of this theory, how about the constructive side? If I'm a tool designer, what can I do in this case? And I want to acknowledge that tool designers can't control every external factor affecting our tool's power relationships. But what we can do is control the design and engineering decisions. And while our call for supporting values of appropriation, adaptation, and composability aren't necessarily new, like here are people who have said that before, I think a lens of power reveals the logic for why holding these values is important. We've seen that power imbalances happen when rigid abstractions are misaligned with artists' idiosyncratic goals. So, right, what if we design tools with sort of multiple API handles or entry points in mind? Going back to the DDB example, if we wanted to support things to make it blue, like what if we created a handle that exposed the parameter mapping so then users could build their own extension and build a speech interface on top if they wish? Or in the other direction, the lower direction, a handle that exposes the function of creating a parameter mapping so users can then create their own unique parameter mapping, such as like RGB values beyond the ones preset in the system. And I think while we can help identify what the most salient abstractions to expose in our system are, predicting sites of appropriation almost seems like an oxymoron, right? Like how can you predict what people are going to appropriate? So I think another way we can help mitigate power imbalances is through focusing on building composable primitives rather than full end-to-end tools where everything is prescribed for you. So, you know, what if instead of deciding on what the right abstraction is for a tool, we focused on discovering what the right primitive would be, what the right building block would be, such that artists could then build up their own abstractions in the tool, what the right interoperable data representations are, so artists can easily transfer their work to other tools to accomplish things that your tool couldn't. The question here then becomes, how do we actually identify what these like right primitives and representations are? And I would like to remind you from the first project that I think professional artists who code are well positioned to answer this. But even if you lack professional artist collaborators, this project developed a sort of table of generative questions to help you think through aspects of power in tools, analytically, critically, and also constructively. And this was taken from this generative theories of interaction paper that I am very inspired by. Wendy McKay is also giving an HCI seminar talk, like I think in a month too. So for instance, in the question of asking what a good primitive would be, you can ask yourself, what is the smallest or lowest unit of useful operation in the tool? And how can it be composed together within the tool or extended to interface with other tools, right? Like this isn't an answer, but at least it's a starting point. So I would want to see a future where our creativity support tools are less like prototypes to test, our hypothesis that X abstraction makes doing Y task Z times faster, or to test the validity of some design principles that we made, but rather where we treat them as design probes. Because I think treating CSTs as design probes could teach us new information about the creative practice itself, rather than the contribution just being the tool itself. And cases where tools fail might be more interesting than cases when tools work. What artists do with the probes might be more interesting than the design of the tool itself. Of course, the flip side then is to shift our values away from always searching for the next research paper and just spend time to actually release and maintain and invest in the communities that the tool is supposed to help. I think that is also another way to mitigate power imbalances here. So to summarize, this work rethought empowerment by showing us that removing obstacles or enabling greater efficiency, being empowered by artistic software tools means that they support actualizing and sharing a human perspective on the world. We talked about the unavoidable power over relationships that tool designers have over their users due to enacting a normative ground, and potential ways to mitigate that, such as through enabling vertical and horizontal movement. Instead of prototypes for efficiency, I think I want to see a future where software tools for artists can also be probes for creativity. So now at the end of this talk, I've hopefully offered a new perspective around how we are building software for and with artists. Returning to my thesis statement, I hope now that we can see that while these technical considerations of such as letting artists retain fine-grained aesthetic control, leverage their manual drawing skills, and move between levels of abstraction are great to empower them, it's also important to have an understanding of the normative ground that they are working in and the power over relationships that are present in tool use. So in terms of future work, where I hope to be conducting more of this research agenda at Pomona College, I want to do things such as, I want to pursue the agenda outlined in the last project, such as longitudinally studying how tools impact power dynamics in artistic communities by using new methods. And what do I mean by new methods? Well, if we believe that CSTs are better served as creativity probes, then this means our research contributions should shift from being artifact-centric to interaction-centric, studying things such as how tools are repurposed by users in the real world through longitudinal use, or the kinds of aesthetic or social relationships they open up, or how they do this, how they fail to do this, and why. I think then this means, in addition to current evaluation methods, survey-based ones like the Creativity Support Index or NASA TLX, we could also draw inspiration from qualitative methods from anthropology, such as offering thick descriptions of tool interaction or valuing participatory community building. While I spent a lot of time talking about power and software tools in this presentation, one limitation that I never explicitly addressed is how these tools intersect with systems of race, class, gender, ability, codified social systems that are explicitly there to give some groups power over others. So I think research questions here would include, what is the role of creativity support tools for marginalized people to respond to the oppressive forces they endure? Or what would creativity support tools to support what Ivan Ilyich calls a convivial society, or what David Graeber says is giving voice to the voiceless, look like? And finally, while in the first project that I argued that artists can also be researchers, I believe the flip side, that researchers can also be artists, and making creativity support tools can be an artistic practice itself. Some of this comes from participating and shaping culture with research, such as supporting artist residencies in your lab or partnering with community art centers. Some of it comes with making research just more accessible, like distributing it as a zine, like I want to make a zine for this WIS talk in a month. But the guiding philosophy of this means that I think the tools that we build ourselves can intentionally propose new normative understandings of the world, right? Like when you're building something, you are setting your values out in the world. So you are actively shaping the world that you want to see. And in the process, also reveal to us something about ourselves, not only as researchers, but also as artists. So hopefully by now I've at least partially convinced you of the value of research that takes creative practices and creative practitioners seriously. Before we do applause, I would like to do some acknowledgements. If you came to my actual thesis defense, these are a little different. This slide is the same. I would like to thank all the collaborators that I've had throughout my PhD. They've been so wonderful, both in these projects here and projects that I haven't shown. Some of them are in the audience right now, and I've learned so much from all of my collaborators. I would love to give a huge shout out to my committee. So the last time I gave this talk was about 5 months ago when it was actually my PhD defense, and we took a nice photo. So thank you, Sean, for being an amazing advisor to me. I really could not have done it with all your support. Thank you also to James for being a committee member, Manish, Camille, and also Jennifer Jacobs, who I feel like was like a third advisor to me as well. Thank you to the Stanford HCI group as a whole. I think in the last version of this, I showed specifically like Manish's group and Sean's group, but now we have everyone. Here are some photos from 4 different years. Like I will always miss dressing up as Zootopia characters and Gates 398, which was my office, the 2 ski retreats that did happen, and you can see the people changing between the years, nice dinners with Sean's pizza oven at his house. I really feel like I learned way more from these students here than anyone else really, so yay peer learning. And also thank you to people from Berkeley who really got me started on my research. So thank you to B Crew, which was Bjorn Hartman's research group. This is a photo from 2015. And especially thank you to Valkyrie Savage, the person in the blue dress, who was my original PhD student mentor, who really took a chance on me. Fun fact was last year, I had a birthday party at Tunnel Tops Park, a new park that opened in the Presidio, and Valkyrie was there. Like I didn't invite her, she was just randomly there, and I was like, wow, what are the chances? Because she lives in Denmark, because she is a professor at the University of Copenhagen. And also she is giving a seminar talk in 3 weeks. So please go see Valkyrie's talks as well. I didn't have a slide for this, but also thank you to the people who really helped me with my teaching, such as Christina or Lisa Yang or like Cynthia. I feel like these, part of the reason why I decided to stay in academia was because I love teaching and mentoring so much. So I really would not be here or be in a faculty position if those people did not teach me so much about teaching. Because this is a public talk, I would like to show my public friends, I think some of whom are on Zoom with me today. So thank you all my friends for making my life in the Bay Area such a wonderful one and filled with such light. And lastly, oh, I have to click here. Thank you to my family. My parents are in the audience today in the background, or in the back row. I'm gonna cry because I thought I could do this talk without crying. But I love my family so much, and I'm so grateful for them and everything that they've done for me. So really, I could not have done anything without you. Okay, so this is a link to my thesis because I've already graduated. If you want to see any of it written online, pearl.stanford.edu/xf605mk27773. Thank you. Happy to take questions, comments, disagreements. Yeah. Yes, aha.
Like, please start.
Hi, Jingyi. Great talk. I guess you commented on it a little bit, but how has your perspective on some of these issues changed since you gave the talk back in May, and like what's evolved since then?
Yeah, great question, great question. If I'm being honest, I did not really revisit this talk or any of my research work since May. But I do think one thing that is continually changing here is the fact that, I don't know, I feel like I'm trying to see how well this theory can generalize as like new advancements come, especially in AI and stuff, right? Like I think the lawsuit thing is a little bit older, and now I feel like there are things such as like control debt, which are giving artists a little bit more control. I think overall it seems to stand up, but yeah, sorry I don't have a better answer to your question.
I think a lot of the conversation, especially as AI art tools have come out, have been really focused on like supporting novices or supporting people who have never done art before. Mm-hmm. Like how can they be empowered to do art? And I think there's been some critiques of that, and I think your talk has come way more from the perspective of how do you support people who are like existing art practitioners who have put in time to develop their skills and are like trying to do more with it. What do you think the difference of these perspectives kind of is, especially in how it influences the type of tools you create? And like, do you have, I have some feelings about really focusing only on supporting novices. I would believe that you might too. And kind of what do you think of how that fits into the power?
Yeah, I feel like in a sense, well, I don't know if I want to make this claim, but how I've been feeling about it is that professionals have more stakes in it, right? Because it's like their economic livelihoods are connected to the kinds of art they make and the kinds of like art that is happening in the background and the kinds of tools that are being released. So I think that's why, in a sense, like power might be more pertinent. I mean, like for novices, it's like, oh, it's just a hobby. Like, what is the actual scale of that impact on my like whole life? Where it's like, oh, I want to do a thing, like a graphic for a presentation, and I won't think of it, versus like someone who spends like multiple hours of every day like dedicated to art practice and stuff. So I think that's one thing that I've been aware of, is just sort of the scale of the power differential in terms of these two separate kinds of groups. Another thing is that one of the people that I interviewed here, who was a professional artist, in terms of like the AI art stuff, like a lot of their things was then trying to really look under the hood of the technology and like appropriate it. Like I think they tried to make like an NFT with a changing URL or something. So it's like, oh, this like violates the assumption that like NFTs always have static URLs. So yeah, I do think like even though the tools are maybe more intended for novices, like there are still professionals who are using them and integrating them into their art practice. Good question. This person, whose name I do not know.
Do you think that these power dynamics can apply to other artistic domains like fashion or music?
Yeah, absolutely. I mainly focused on visual art in this thesis, but I think that is a great domain for future work because I think like power dynamics just apply to any area of life. I think there might be different considerations for like the domain specific ones. For instance, like one big thing here, I was like, oh, artists react to like visual changes. Well, like music is not visual, but it is real time and also ephemeral. So I think it would be really interesting to dive deeper in that and see like, okay, for these different domains, or like fashion, right? There's the like sustainability part and like the fast fashion part, like what do these actually mean if we go deeper? Yeah. Sorry for the mic passing.
Amazing talk. I was wondering if you mentioned this a little bit, but there's both negative and positive places where people can have power to and power over. And there was like one instance that you're like, well, this is power over, but not necessarily in a negative way. I was just wondering if you have thoughts on, just expand on that. And it's not necessarily always bad to restrict.
Yeah, I
certain
mean,
things.
just take your PhD program, for example, or any like educational instance, right? I think teachers have a lot of power over their students, but I feel like most of the time is coming genuinely from like a place of learning or a place of guiding you and like having you grow to be the best kind of person that you want to be. So I think that is one concrete example of like, oh yeah, there is a power over relationship, but like it's not necessarily a bad one. Right. Of course, there are parts that can be bad about it.
I'm just wondering, in the theory, like, do you have specific places that you're addressing it? Because I think it's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And like, how do you mitigate over exerting power or versus like when is it good?
Going back to the novices thing, I think it's mainly in the context of CSTs, like tools for novices, right? Because again, like I do think a lot, these tools have power over in terms of how they structure, how you think and stuff, but like, I feel like the researchers always mean it from a good place.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was really lovely. I have maybe a bit of a speculative question, which is that I think each three things that you presented here, hinged on ideas of like exploration, of direct manipulation, of correspondence as something that is like artists especially like engage in and work in and exploring what that really means in context. And I'm wondering if the lessons you've learned here help us like learn something more about like making software or programming in general, right? That programming is also this kind of creative thing. I mean, we could go speculatively to propose that like making software is also a form of deliberate seeing and thinking, right? It carries.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Different, right? So like, yeah, I guess I'm thinking about like expanding to other kinds of computer science. Like, do you think that we can kind of map these lessons onto other places? Or maybe on the flip side, are there special concerns that we might want to have in trying to map like what we've learned here to other places in computer science? And like, should we be cautious maybe about doing something like this?
Yeah, this is a really great question. It's also a very big question. I think going back to this person's question, like I do think there are domain-specific concerns of like the history and the context of specific things. But like honestly, part of, I feel like the paper, the last work was like, this is just sort of like my life philosophy and like the values that I hold. So in a way, I do want to apply it to everything that I do. But I don't like, I cautious against like overgeneralization without like sort of knowing the context and the history behind things. Sorry, that wasn't a very specific answer, but yeah.
Great. Well, let's thank Jingyi for a wonderful talk.